This is my second trip to Carlisle since my book came out, and it's kind of the epicenter of Jim Thorpe's life, so I'll come here as many times as people want me to. It was a beautiful drive up this morning. The weather hadn't quite turned yet, but the leaves had, and so it was a terrific drive up. Plus, I just decided this year that I'm off football, so it's nice to spend a Sunday afternoon doing something else and not being preoccupied with that difficult sport. I'm sorry?
Steelers play tonight.
Yeah, well, I'm not watching. So, it was more than 20 years ago. I was in Denver, Colorado, on a book tour for my book on Vietnam, when a gentleman from the Oneida Nation in Wisconsin approached me after my event with a little packet of papers, and he said, "David, I've got your next book for you." And I looked at it and said, "Jim Thorpe." And I very politely said to him, "Thank you. I never take advice from other people on what I'm going to write. It has to come organically from inside me. I have to be obsessed with the subject." But Norbert Hill, who was that Oneida man, planted a seed in me, and I didn't realize it until 15 or so years later. And I came to realize that Jim Thorpe was my next book, 10 books later. And I consider it the third book in a trilogy of sports biographies that transcend sports. The first being Vince Lombardi, who not only was a legendary professional football coach, but an opportunity for me to write about the mythology of competition and success in American life, and what it takes and what it costs. The book on Roberto Clemente, not just a beautiful baseball player, but also a chance to write about the Latino experience in mainland America. And more than that, so many athletes are labeled heroes, but very few really are. And Clemente was. His motto was, "If you have a chance to help others and fail to do so, you're wasting your time on this earth." And he died living out that motto, trying to deliver humanitarian aid to Nicaragua after an earthquake in 1972, when he heard that the strongman dictator of Nicaragua, Anastasio Somoza, was actually diverting the aid from getting to the people. And Clemente said, "I'll go there, make sure it gets to the people," and he died in a plane crash trying to deliver it. So Jim Thorpe is the third in that trilogy. Not just an athlete of unparalleled accomplishments. You know, it's hard to compare athletes from different generations because of differences in training and diet and equipment and everything. But no athlete did what Jim Thorpe did in terms of winning gold medals in the decathlon and pentathlon, being an All-American football player here at Carlisle, the first great professional football player, the first president of what would become the National Football League, and a Major League Baseball player. That trifecta is something that no one has done before or since. But that's not why I decided to write the story. What I would like to do is use the drama and action of sports to illuminate American history and sociology. So Jim Thorpe offered me the opportunity through his incredible career and life to explore the Native American experience. And it just so happens that the years of Jim Thorpe's life, the brackets of it, born in 1887 in Indian Territory of what would become Oklahoma, dying in 1953 in Southern California. Those 2 years are seminal years in the history of the government's treatment of Native Americans. 1887 was the year of the enactment of the Dawes Act, which was another effort by the government to strip Indians of their land, in this case, take away their communal property and sort of half-heartedly make them private landowners in a way that many of them cannot hold that land. So it led to the loss of millions of acres of Native American territories, including especially in the Dakotas and in Oklahoma. You know, the famed Oklahoma land rush or land runs of the 1890s were essentially white settlers going into Indian territory and taking their land. So land thieves and their abettors are what Boomer Sooner stands for. And then 1953, the year that Jim Thorpe died, was the year of a detribalization act in Congress, part of an effort to eliminate tribes, government recognition of tribes. Luckily, that persisted for not too long, and the retribalization happened. But those are the two brackets of Jim Thorpe's life, and in between is Carlisle and the Indian boarding school experience, which is really at the center of all of that. And Jim Thorpe went through 3 boarding schools in his life. The first one in Oklahoma, the Sac and Fox boarding school. He went there with his twin brother, Charlie. They were born in 1887, as I said, in May. That night of their birth, there was a thunderstorm over the North Canadian River where the family lived. And that's where the title of my book comes from. That was Jim Thorpe's, the poetic version of his Sac and Fox name, Path Lit by Lightning. 7 or 8 years later, they're at the boarding school in Stroud, Oklahoma, and a disease sweeps through the school, and Charlie dies. The first of so many deaths in Jim Thorpe's life, but emblemizing the sad experience of so many young kids who went through Indian boarding schools. After his brother died, Jim tried to run away from that school several times. His father sent him further away to the Haskell Institute in Kansas. He was there from ages 11 to 13. It's there that he came to love football. He was taken under the wing of Haskell's greatest football player, Chauncey Archiquette, from the Oneida Nation in Wisconsin, who gave little Jim, his first football, which was made of leather straps and some cotton stuffed inside it. But Thorpe, like so many of the kids there, often would run away from that school as well. So his father, Hiram Thorpe, who was a ruffian to say the least. Hiram Thorpe had 5 wives and 18 children. He sold liquor from the back of a wagon, bootleg liquor, in Indian Territory. And his 5th wife wanted nothing to do with young Jim, so they sent him even further away. And that's how he ended up here at Carlisle at age 16. And sort of unbelievably for anybody who looks at Jim Thorpe as this magnetic, electric presence. When he got to Carlisle, at age 16, he stood 5'5" and weighed 115 pounds. So he obviously grew very quickly after that. But the first 3 years, he arrived here in 1904. And his first 3 years at Carlisle, he was barely here. As your great archivist, Barbara Landis, who helped give me a tour of Carlisle, has noted, so much of what happened at Carlisle really didn't happen here. It was in the outing system. And Jim Thorpe spent most of his first 3 years on various outings, which were somewhat of a scam, in a sense that these young students would be sent off to the farms in this area, in Pennsylvania, Maryland, Delaware, and New Jersey, to basically be indentured servants for local farmers as part of the acculturation process. And they'd get paid a minimum amount, which would go back to the school and maybe get to them. At the same time, the government was paying the school for every student they had. So Jim Thorpe wasn't even here for most of the first 3 years. But that was just one part of Carlisle's problematic, difficult, complex history. It was founded as I'm preaching to the choir now, in some sense. But the Carlisle Indian Industrial School was founded in 1879, only a few years after the Battle of the Little Bighorn. The first students were mostly the children of the Lakota Sioux, sent here as an effort to tame them, in essence. The founder of the school, Richard Henry Pratt's motto was, "Kill the Indian, save the man." In other words, it was an attempt at complete acculturation and assimilation. Take away their language, take away their religion, take away their culture, dress them, cut their hair and dress them in the uniforms of the U.S. Cavalry, all as a part of an effort to bring them into white society. Now Pratt, like so many of the people of that era who were running the boarding schools, thought they were doing good. They literally thought they were saving this race, and not really taking into account the diminishing aspects of what they were doing. Jim Thorpe would never be known if it weren't for Carlisle. This is where he gained his fame, so that's part of the contradiction and complexity. And so many of the students who went through the boarding process, as disparaging as it was, learned how to survive, became doctors and lawyers, and their children became the activists who have helped sort of replenish the Native American heritage and culture. So that's part of that complexity. But Thorpe's rise in athletics began in 1907. It sounds like a myth. It's one of those, there's so many actually mythological parts of Jim Thorpe's athletic career. This one is essentially true. He was working on the farm here, and one day in the spring of 1907 walked past the track and saw some guys trying to clear the bar in the high jump at 6 feet, and they were failing, and Jim Thorpe, in his overalls, easily cleared the bar, and the next day he was on the track team. And pretty soon he was on the football team, and his rise in athletics started from there. His coach, in both track and football, was Pop Warner, who is, again, a very complicated figure. A brilliant football coach, innovative, helped sort of popularize the forward pass, which was only legalized a few years before Jim Thorpe got there. Developed many of the formations that became popular in football over the course of the 20th century. Was also a trickster. I love the fact that one year he developed a kangaroo pocket in one of the uniforms, and they'd hide the ball in there. First hidden ball trick. Another time they were playing the University of Chicago, and he had an end line up near the opposition bench and run behind the bench and come out on the other side to catch a pass. I think that I wish that were true today. It would help my Green Bay Packers, maybe. Although I'm off football, I say. So he was, Pop Warner was a very innovative coach, and brilliant at that, and not a brilliant man, and not actually worthy, in my opinion, of the fame that he got, where youth football is now called Pop Warner football, and we'll get to the reasons why later. But Jim Thorpe's rise at Carlisle was stunning, and I think that one could say that 1912 was the greatest single year any athlete has ever had, and it was Jim Thorpe. That was the year that he went off to Stockholm to win those gold medals. He competed in both the decathlon and the pentathlon, which means 15 events, plus 2 other events that he didn't win medals in. 17 events in less than 2 weeks. The scoring systems were so different then, as was everything else, that it's hard to compare a decathlete from one era to another. But Jim Thorpe beat his competition by a greater margin than anybody has before or since, and that's really the way to judge someone in the contemporary milieu that they're performing in. Not only did he win by that margin, but he competed in a couple of events after he lost his shoes. The myth is that they were stolen. I could find no documentation of that. They're more likely you just couldn't find them. In any case, they had to put together a pair of mismatched shoes, different sizes. And that actually the photo on the cover of my book, if it would have gone down, it would have shown him wearing different socks on each foot, because he had to wear thicker socks on one foot because it was a different size shoe. He still won that event, the high jump, wearing those different shoes. And at the end of those Olympics, he was given 2 gold medals and 2 wonderful trophies, the Tsar of Russia trophy and the King of Sweden trophy. And the King of Sweden, King Gustav V, said to him, "You, sir, are the most wonderful athlete in the world, or the greatest athlete in the world." There's actually no real audio of that, but he said one of those 2 things. To which the mythology is that Thorpe answered, "Thanks, King." He didn't. He said, "Thank you." You know, it is funny, but it was one of those things propagated by the press of that era as essentially a means of saying, you know, this is just a quote-unquote uneducated Indian, and he wouldn't know any better and just say, "Thanks, King." But he didn't say it. In any case, he was the greatest athlete in the world. And then he comes back to Carlisle and has a brilliant senior or final year playing on the football team. And just as I consider that year the greatest single athletic achievement of any athlete, I consider one game that year against West Point the greatest act of retribution in athletic history. It was at West Point, Carlisle against Army, the Indians against the Army, and the Indians won. They thrashed them 27-6. And Jim Thorpe was the star of that game. And on the opposition, on the bench of the opposition was Omar Bradley, playing linebacker and running back on Army was Dwight David Eisenhower. And Eisenhower's plan before the game with one of his teammates was to knock Thorpe out of the game. You know, football has always been a rough, collision, violent sport. There's nothing new about that. You know, one of the themes of many of my books is the fallacy of the innocent past. There's always this longing for some golden era when everything was clean and clear, and it really never was when you study history. And so football in the early parts of the 20th century was so violent it was almost eliminated as a sport. And they had to really change the rules to try to make it less violent, but even in 1912 it was. So Eisenhower and a teammate conspired to concuss Thorpe and knock him out of the game by hitting him high and low. And they did. And he was on the ground and for about a minute, and then he got up and kept playing. And soon he basically knocked Eisenhower out of the game. Who never played again, not just because of that collision. He also fell off a horse a couple of weeks later. But anyway, so you had 2 generals there. I love the way that so many figures in American society intersected with Thorpe during his life. During those Olympics, for instance, on that same team with him was George S. Patton, another general from World War II. Patton competed in what was called the modern pentathlon. It was different from Thorpe's pentathlon. It was all military style events. So it was fencing and equestrian and target shooting. And Patton did not win a medal. He actually, which is kind of interesting when you think about the controversies of his career, he claimed that he should have, but that in the target shooting he didn't get a medal, he didn't finish in the top 3. He claimed because his bullets went right through the previous shot. So, whereas the judges said he missed it altogether. He also, by the way, acknowledged that he took opium, which was called pop, before he competed in one of his events, a running event. So anyway, that was George S. Patton. But Thorpe's brilliance in that game and the fact that Carlisle won that game was, to me, just such a poetic justice. But then Thorpe's life very quickly after that turned for the worse. It was in January of 1913, only a few months after that brilliant game and the Olympics before that a story appeared in the Worcester Telegram in Massachusetts, involving an interview with a man who said he managed Jim Thorpe in summer baseball in the Eastern Carolina League in 1909 and 1910. And that implied that Thorpe had been a professional. And very quickly after that, his medals were taken away from him and the trophies were sent back across the Atlantic. It's one of the most unjust acts in American athletic history. And there are 4 reasons for that I document in the book. The first is, it's true, he did play baseball, Bush League baseball, for the Rocky Mountain Railroaders and the Fayetteville Highlanders for those 2 summers, as did scores of college athletes in that era. It was very common for college players to play summer baseball for a minimum amount of pay, maybe $2 a game or $30 a month. Many of them played under aliases, precisely to keep their amateur status. There were so many aliases in the Eastern Carolina League that it was called the Pocahontas League because everyone was named John Smith. Dwight Eisenhower comes up again. He played in the Kansas State League under the name Wilson. Jim Thorpe played under the name Jim Thorpe. He never tried to hide it during that entire period. Secondly, there's a question of men in power who knew precisely what Jim Thorpe was doing and lied about it to save their own reputations. One of those was Pop Warner, Jim's coach. As soon as that story broke, Pop Warner said he knew nothing about it, that Jim Thorpe must have been innocent, although Thorpe acknowledged it himself a day later. But in fact, Warner knew exactly what Thorpe had been doing. He had been sending players to play summer baseball for years. One of his close associates here in Pennsylvania, the coach at Albright College, had been the scout who sent Thorpe and 2 of his teammates down to the Rocky Mountain team that summer. Pop Warner met with Jim Thorpe several times during the period that he was playing baseball, and they talked about it. But he said he didn't know about it to save his own reputation. As did Moses Friedman, the superintendent at Carlisle, who documents show was writing Thorpe letters saying, don't play summer baseball, and then writing letters saying, I don't really want you to come back after you do. But when the story broke, Moses Friedman said he knew nothing about it. And finally, James E. Sullivan, who was the head of the Amateur Athletic Union and of the American Olympic Committee. You know, the Sullivan Award is given every year to the greatest amateur athlete in America. Well, Sullivan was also on the board of advisors of the Carlisle Athletic Association. He too knew that their greatest player was gone playing baseball, and he too lied about it. And those 3 men are the ones most responsible for turning back Thorpe's medals and trophies. Then there's the whole issue of who's an amateur and who's a professional. Was George S. Patton an amateur working for the U.S. Army, getting paid by the Army to train for those very events that he competed in, while Thorpe was playing baseball, which had nothing to do with the events he was playing in? The entire Swedish national team was given a leave of absence for 6 months before the Olympics began with pay to train for those Olympics. Are they professionals or amateurs compared with Jim Thorpe? That issue was there for decades and decades until finally the Olympics got rid of the amateur requirement. But it had a profound effect on one athlete more than anyone else, and that was Jim Thorpe. And finally, there's even a technical reason why it was wrong. The Olympic rules said that for any challenge to be filed against someone's amateur status, it had to be done within 30 days of the end of the Olympics. And the story broke 6 months later. So even technically, it was out of bounds. So morally, hypocritically, and technically, what happened to Jim Thorpe was unjust. And really only this year this July was it finally fully rectified and his records were restored. That was one of the many losses in Jim Thorpe's life. It was starting with the loss of his twin brother, to whom he was more closely connected than anyone in the world. Then by age 16, he was orphaned. His mother had died earlier, and his father died as soon as he got to Carlisle. Another loss. The loss of lands of the Sac and Fox people from the very beginning of his life, and then the loss of the Meadows. And really, when you study his life after that, it was many losses. He struggled. You know, as I was writing the final 10 chapters of this book, I kept rooting for something better to happen to him, but knowing that it was not going to. He did play professional football and well, and was the first great star of football. He played baseball for John McGraw's Giants, was mismanaged by McGraw, in my opinion, and never got the chance to show what he could do until finally in 1919, he was traded to the Boston Braves and basically led the league in hitting the entire year until the very end. And was a star on a status with his crosstown Boston Red Sox, Babe Ruth. But never quite got the shot that he needed. And during that year, right before that, when the flu epidemic swept through the country, including Carlisle and New York, Jim Thorpe lost his namesake son, Jim Thorpe Jr. at age 3. So that was another loss that he was feeling. But during those final, the afterlife, as I call it, I mean, every athlete has, you know, their lives, in one sense, end in their 30s, you know, because their whole sensibility is as an athlete. And many of them struggle in that afterlife after that, and Jim Thorpe certainly did. He also struggled with alcoholism and being away from home. He lost his first 2 wives, divorced him because of his drinking. He had 7 children, and during the period when he was struggling, trying to figure out what job could give him stability, moving from state to state, living in more than 20 states over the course of that afterlife. His children really didn't get to see him much. At one point, he went to visit his youngest daughter, Grace, who was at the Haskell Institute, and she was 7 or 8 years old, and he was there to perform at halftime. And he said he had to reintroduce himself to his own daughter. But eventually, he ended up having 7 kids, 3 daughters, 7 who lived, 3 daughters and 4 sons. And eventually, they all came to appreciate what he had gone through. You know, at one point in the 1930s, he was digging ditches in Los Angeles during the Depression. He worked as a greeter at various taverns and bars. Probably the most meaningful work he had during that period was in Hollywood. He was on the fringes of the studio industry and acted, quote unquote, in more than 70 movies. Sometimes they'd be billed with Jim Thorpe or starring Jim Thorpe, and you could barely find him in the movie, but he was famous. So they used him in that way. But what was important about that is that it was a period when Thorpe was reasserting his identity. As an athlete was one thing, he was focused on sports. As his athletic talents diminished, and he struggled, he came to think more and more about the injustices that were done to him and to his people. And as in Hollywood, he became the spokesperson for about the 200 or 300 Native Americans out there who were trying to get jobs. In the industry, there were so many Westerns being produced, and they were often hiring white people to play Indians and putting grease paint on them, war paint. And Thorpe was speaking up, saying, hire us. And also trying to get the Hollywood to reduce the negative stereotypes that were used in so many of those movies, which is something Thorpe had been dealing with his entire career. You know, here at Carlisle, whenever the team played, the sports writers would say they're going on the warpath, right, and taking scalps and they're all of the players are called chief. They weren't chiefs. You know, all of the stereotypes of well-meaning sports writers who thought they were championing the Carlisle Indian School, but just society used that sort of verbiage to describe Native Americans. So Thorpe had to deal with that, first in athletics and then in Hollywood. Finally, in 1951, 20 years after he'd signed an option to have a movie made of his life, it was made. Some of you maybe have seen it. Jim Thorpe, All-American, starring Burt Lancaster. Lancaster is a great movie star. He's not Native American. He was very sympathetic to Thorpe, and he was a good athlete. He had been an acrobat. He could perform many of the skills that Thorpe had to perform for the decathlon. The director was Michael Curtiz, a great director who had done Casablanca. And as I said, it was a very sympathetic movie, but it was wrong in almost every respect, small and large. You know, the opening scene shows young Jim Thorpe in Oklahoma, except the San Gabriel Mountains of California are in the background. And so many, the entire chronology is off in so many ways, but you know, that's what biographical movies do, and some of that poetic license is fine. But in my opinion, it was wrong in the most important respect, which is that the narrator of the movie, the hero of the movie, was not Jim Thorpe, it was Pop Warner. He narrates the film. The implication is that he's the white savior, that if only Thorpe had listened to Pop and more successfully acculturated himself into white society, he wouldn't have had the troubles that he had faced in his life, which is a very superficial and disparaging way of looking at Jim Thorpe's life. So, you know, the movie, on one hand, got a lot of people interested and sympathetic to Thorpe, but when you really study the movie, it's a quite different matter. The weirdest part of Jim's life, as you Pennsylvanians know, is what happened to him after he died. Unbelievable. You know, he wanted to be buried in Oklahoma. He was on his third wife, Patsy Thorpe, who was, unlike Iva, his first wife, Iva Miller, who went to Carlisle Indian Industrial School and was a good student, and only discovered in her late teens, early 20s, that she wasn't even a Native American. But her father had sent her and her siblings to an Indian boarding school in Oklahoma first, after the mother died, and she grew up thinking she was Indian, and she wasn't. But in any case, Iva was young and naive and in love with this great athletic hero. The second wife, Frida, was even younger and more naive and in love with this great hero. And both discovered during the course of their marriages that he was more difficult to deal with than that. Patsy, the third wife, was Thorpe's equal in some senses. She was a drinker like him. She was tough. She was manipulative in both a good and bad sense. She was trying to get the world to recognize Jim in a way that she thought he was under-recognized, but she was also manipulating everything and upsetting anybody that they dealt with, basically. Anyway, Thorpe dies of a heart attack at age 65. His coffin is sent back to Oklahoma in the middle of a ceremony conducted by his Sac and Fox people. Patsy interrupts the ceremony, takes his coffin away because she's unhappy with how much money Oklahoma's going to put into honoring him with a mausoleum. And then essentially puts him up to the highest bidder. First his coffin is taken to Tulsa, and then ends up in Pennsylvania. And this is the weirdest part. She's in Philadelphia watching television and sees a story on television about these two small towns in the Pocono Mountains, Mauch-Chunk and East Mauch-Chunk, that had once been great tourist towns and then had coal, but were down on their luck. and holding this nickel-a-day drive to try to get economic development. And she watches this show and comes up with this plan. I compare her to Harold Hill in The Music Man. She goes up to these two twin towns and basically says, if you merge and change your name to Jim Thorpe, Pennsylvania, you can have it. And I'll also, we'll build a Jim Thorpe College and a Jim Thorpe Hospital, and I'll build a teepee motel in town, and maybe the pro football, the NFL will decide to build its Pro Football Hall of Fame here. None of that happens, except they do vote to merge, and they change their name to Jim Thorpe, up the road from here. And it's a place that Jim Thorpe had never set foot in his entire life. I have absolutely nothing against the people of Jim Thorpe, Pennsylvania. I wish them well, but I don't think he belongs there. But I don't think he'll ever get to where he belongs. Even he can't rest even after death. But this year, in July, he did get his medals fully restored, and his records are back on the books. And there's another part of it that makes me feel better about the story, which is, was his life a tragedy? I don't think so. For as many troubles as he faced, he kept persevering, he kept looking for a new job, he kept trying. In 1915, the most popular sculpture statue in America was called The End of the Trail. And it showed an Indian slumped on horseback on a slumped horse. And the implication was that it's all over, that it's a dying race, that manifest destiny had prevailed, that Indians had become an anachronism, and they were dying and would soon be dead. And at the turn of the century, before Europeans got to America, there were perhaps 7 to 8 million or more indigenous peoples on this continent. By the turn of the century, there were fewer than 300,000. But it didn't happen. They prevailed. They figured out how to survive against all the odds. There are now a few million. Their cultures are being restored bit by bit around the country. And I sort of look at Jim Thorpe as emblematic of that. He kept going. His 7 children all became somewhat successful. 3 of his sons became military officers. His daughters all got college degrees and became activists in the Indian movements, not just for restoring his medals, but for restoring their people's place in this society. Some of the great-grandchildren are in the Back to the Earth movement in Oklahoma and elsewhere. And so I see it not as a tragedy, but as an act of perseverance that is a lesson for all of us. Thank you very much.